Well, our speaker today is John Hubbard. He's come all the way from Westbourne to be with us. John is a member of Dorset Humanists and a retired teacher of English. John has always had a fascination for human artefacts, particularly in the form of buildings, boats and paintings. He often goes on pilgrimages to France in the footsteps of painters such as Van Gogh and Alfred Sisley. His last talk for us about Poundbury has had more than 2,500 views on YouTube. So we may be a select gathering here this evening, but to everyone watching online, welcome. John is going to talk to us about the English impressionist Alfred Sisley, so will you please give him a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much. On the 29th of January 1899, at the comparatively young age of 59, Alfred Sisley died in the small town of Moret-sur-Loing, some 50 miles south of Paris. His life partner and latterly wife, Eugénie, had died before him in October of the previous year. Both are buried in the cemetery up the hill of the town they had lived in or close to for their last 20 years. Their two children, Jeanne and Pierre, although embarked on careers in artistic fields, had only 1,000 francs worth of household chattels now to their name. This precarious situation was remedied by the loyalty of Monet, whom Sisley had asked to come to him as he lay dying of throat cancer and asked him to do what he could for his boy and girl. In May, an auction was held of paintings and pastels by Sisley, along with paintings donated by his early friends, Pissarro, Renoir, Cézanne, Guillaumin, Degas and Monet himself, whose energies and devotion in communication produced the sum of 145,000 francs to be divided for their security between the two children. It was a prodigious figure, helped by the increase in value of Sisley's work that had already begun as news reached the capital that he was terminally ill and would paint no more. It was also a testimony to the respect in which he was held as a fellow artist. Among his works, those of the 1870s are often held to be the finest, but the story is not, as the critic Richard Shone insists, one of decline thereafter, as many of the Moret area paintings of the 80s and 90s can easily hold their own with the best of that earlier period, sharing the same sensitive precision in the representation of season, weather and time of day, through exact attention to the quality of light and the response of air and surface to it. In the story of Impressionism, Sisley is often somewhat sidelined, partly from his later social and geographical separation from his earlier companions, partly from an absolute dedication to landscape alone, and a consistency in a personal viewpoint that was settled quite early. Although his manner of handling paint and colour did evolve as the years passed, he did not undertake significant experimentations or major revisions of his selections of subjects as, say, Pissarro had done. There is a regular capturing of exact moments of place as we experience them and move through them, and the human figure is very often present in his work. And I set you a little challenge during this evening to see if you can find those figures in even some of the broader landscapes. Yet beside this awareness of movement, there's also a sense of absolute quiet and stillness, a sense of suspended stillness you can still find today, perhaps surprisingly, in the same streets and rivers and locks by which Sisley first set up his easel over 150 years ago. Yet for a long time, this perhaps purest of Impressionists was regarded as less noteworthy, compared disparagingly with his peers, and even dismissed as a minor artist. Although he was thought worthy of a complete catalogue raisonné by 1959, the essays which open the 1992 exhibition catalogue still have a slightly defensive tone. When Richard Shone revised his monograph around the centenary of Sisley's death, he re-emphasised how little documentary evidence there was to draw on, particularly relating to his earlier life. There are few letters remaining either, though his contemporaries sometimes referred to him in their correspondence. The overall sense you receive from this is the man a little apart from the famous central figures, or one who became increasingly so. He certainly did not meet with the lifetime success of Monet or Renoir, and, like Pissarro, he was often in difficult financial circumstances. This sense of personal silence is amplified, of course, by the fact that many of the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists had a great deal to say for themselves on paper. So, perhaps more than so many of his contemporaries, we have to allow his paintings, and perhaps those of him, to speak for themselves more loudly than those whose colouring from correspondence helps them to settle within an exactitude of personal experience. But why the title, The Place of Light? Surely, you might argue, every artist is concerned in their work with qualities of reflection, luminosity and radiance. Take this Pissarro autumn morning in Paris, for example, or a Van Gogh of an evening on the Rhone, or one of Monet's capturings of the west front of the cathedral at Rouen. All are clearly interested in the place of light. Yet I would suggest that with Sisley's insistent focus on broad landscapes with low horizons and arching skies, with water, with the most subtle changes of season and day as they reverberate in the most ordinary of street scenes too, Sisley's preoccupation with light is focal. From the brilliancy of high summer to the muffled hues of an overcast, snowy day. At his very best, he allows the settled radiance of any moment to hold and sustain all before it. It is not without significance that although he painted plenty of scenes of streets and squares and woods, he always lived in settlements on or near a river, and the reflections of skies and buildings on the surface of water delighted him as much as the echo of sun or cloud in streets and open spaces. But first, let's say a little more about the man himself. Although born in Paris, Alfred was the youngest child of English parents, and despite two failed attempts in later life to become a French citizen, he remained an Englishman to his death. France, though, was the country in which he was resident for the whole of his life. He might easily have accepted from his prosperous family a settled place in bourgeois society and commercial life. The family business of import and export saw his father in charge of their Paris office, which specialised in gloves and luxury goods. It was a business in tune with the self-indulgent times, serving the needs of the new rich and the growing and secure middle class of the Second Empire. Alfred's Bohemian friends always attributed his gentlemanly manner and correct self-presentation to his nationality. He was fluent in both English and French, which incidentally made him particularly popular with American art students in the Paris of the 1860s. His own story is not untypical, of a young man drawn to express himself artistically among the uncertain world of those like-minded souls whose decision provoked suspicion from those more conventionally industrious, if less inspired peers. Peers who belonged to a confident class reinforcing its boundaries through disciplines of work, rigidities of propriety, and the tools of social exclusion. To those accustomed to the office, the ledger and copperplate writing, the liberties of independent choice, the open air and the rapid drawing with a brush must have seemed a subject of envy, at least to those with some sympathy, and anathema to those without. We're so used to seeing the Impressionists as consummate and attractive creators that we need to remind ourselves always that they were revolutionary artists, with some of the air of insurrection and social turbulence that had troubled and frightened France for 80 years and continue to do so. Their disruptive status inevitably meant that they were considerably less favourably regarded as artists than those who still clung to the formalities of composition and painting that were the domain of the studio, the leisured comfort of the indoor easel, and the approbation of the selectors of the salon. Ironically, it was during a period in England where Alfred was sent to acquire a familial business interest in cross-channel trading that he was diverted into a deep love of painting by becoming familiar with the work of both Constable and Turner in the public galleries in London. Not long after, we find him enrolled in Paris as a student at the Atelier Glaire, where he became particularly close to three of his classmates: Frédéric Bazille, who was also studying to become a doctor, and Claude Monet and Auguste Renoir. The last two outlived him, but Bazille was killed at the age of 29 in a skirmish in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Although a little critical of Glaire's rather outmoded views, the group were respectful of his kindness and generosity to his students. It seemed uniquely amongst tutors he charged very little for studio space and materials. As a gang, they led a life of friendly exploration in the world of outdoor painting, with expeditions to the forest of Fontainebleau and evenings together with other students. Renoir's collections of Sisley are of a delightful human being, and one much given to flirting and chatting up young women. Sisley was perhaps rather better off than his contemporaries, and his family and Bazille's were welcoming and supportive of Renoir, who, as you've seen, painted both William and Son in the 1860s. But by the end of the summer of 1867, both Sisley and Monet had become fathers. Sisley's Pierre was born on the 17th of June to Eugénie Lecouzet, the woman who would share his life with him for the next 30 years, and who was always known as Madame Sisley. Monet's Jean was born on July the 9th to the artist's mistress and later first wife, Camille Dancieux. Eugénie was a florist whose family had been ruined in some risky financial venture. No image of the lovely little face that Renoir talks about exists. Renoir testifies also to her very sensitive nature and his sense that she was exceedingly well bred, a characteristic that was bound to appeal to Sisley's gentlemanly and fastidious demeanour. Although Sisley appeared in Renoir's painting known as The Engaged Couple, it is not in fact Eugénie who is on his arm, but another woman who modelled for Renoir in numerous other paintings. In January 1869, a daughter, Jeanne, completed the family, but this was a group that was estranged from their more respectable cousins, one of whom wrote, as to Alfred, on account of his irregular liaison, one did not mix with him. It appears that this was the reason why his father may well have ended his allowance to him rather than letting it lapse after the Franco-Prussian War ruined the family business and left this rather elegant man, sadly, in very reduced circumstances for the rest of his life. The war also, it appears, was responsible for the loss of much early work. The same is true, in fact, of Pissarro, as Sisley had to abandon a lodging in Bougival in something of a hurry for the safer centre of Paris. Bougival was later overrun with destructive German soldiers, so that although we can be sure he was steadily painting in the late 60s, the catalogue does not spring into any abundance until 1872. Of those works that remain from around this time in the capital, his fascination with water is exemplified by studies of the famous Canal Saint-Martin in the eastern side of the city. Of those listed in a letter from a trip to Honfleur at the time Pierre was born, not a single trace remains. In the early 1870s, he continued to share expeditions with friends. His studies of an overcast Argenteuil in late autumn and on a clear winter's day are among those which share almost exactly the same view with paintings by Monet. The ordinariness of the town and the sense of calm activity rather than intense metropolitan bustle seem to have appealed to him. In the picture of the square in the Rue de la Chaussée, the falling of light from between the buildings provides an interesting range of shapes and shadows that contrast with the geometrical regularities of the buildings. The same strong sense of street perspective is also present in a study of the Boulevard Héloïse in a beautifully captured misty air in quite different colours. The river responsible is some 150 yards to the right of the trees here. In both, we note the people in motion, going about their business. Equally noteworthy is the economy of depiction, which is evident too in the picture of the Grande Rue, where simple deft short strokes create receding buildings and their windows. On the left, the shop front's upper stories hold the stronger light from the sky, which is also glimpsed in the cobbles on a one glint of standing water at the gutter in front of the painting before the horse-drawn van. And you get a glimmer of light just catching the gold letters on the shop name just there. The sense of accuracy of proportion and recession is very powerful, as is that of the deeply layered sky. The regular presence of Renoir in another small town, Lucienne, was perhaps influential in Sisley's move there with his family in 1872. The place was still recovering from the war. It was rather further out of the city than Argenteuil, although distances are distorted by the very circuitous paths of the River Seine and sometimes the railway lines. But it was another very compact and unhurried place with delightful lanes and ranges of houses. In describing his life close to Paris, Schoen echoes Anita Bruckner's 1957 assessment in calling Sisley a painter of the suburbs. But I don't think they could be more wrong in adopting a word that in our 20th century took on a very particular meaning, more associated with the contiguous mass housing of Betjeman's Metroland. It is true that Argenteuil, Bougival, Lucienne, Sèvres, Marly and so on are all outside the city, but they are not suburban in any way we'd understand it at present. In fact, several of the places have a distinctly unurban and highly individual atmosphere. That sense of unurban otherness is emphasised by the fact that there were even small guidebooks produced for Parisians drawing attention to their small-scale riverside and rural delights as places of recreation away from the hard bustle of the city, easily achieved for weekend escapes from the great canopied railway stations. A walk in any of them, even today, will reveal to the stroller the small towns they once quite clearly were, although some now stand surrounded by large blocks of social housing, new shopping areas and dual carriageways, as at Argenteuil, or more expensive flats and developments of comfortable houses along the roads and lanes that focus on them, as at Lucienne. The core of shop fronts and houses from the early 19th century and earlier is very clear, even though if over the last 20 years the old uniformities have been rather compromised by the slightly self-conscious prettifying using various colour washes and extremely bold painting of shutters and window frames, which you will find now rather than the mellow shades of cream and grey that used to mark them. Each of these places, though easily enough reached by the then young railways, was surrounded by woodland, by open country or parkland, or acres of productive market gardening. Argenteuil in its heyday was famous for this, and for both its crops of asparagus and of figs. Even today, vestiges of these old associations manifest themselves in large acres of allotments standing by the railway line. Essentially, though each of these places was a distinctive settlement, usually radiating from a church and a square. Perhaps the most clear signs of the shift towards closer association with the metropolitan were the rebuildings of their quaint old parish churches on the grand scale, especially the neo-Norman basilica at Argenteuil, the home of some famous, if slightly dubious, relics. Bougival, also by the riverside, famous in its time for laundry work and for its locks on the Seine, had the church with its famous 12th century bell tower and east end restored and extended and modernised considerably. The church stands at the top of a rising, uniform street that leads up the hill from the shallow crescent of buildings closer to the water. What distinguishes Marly and Lucienne is that they are both atop a bluff that stands on the south side of the Seine, to which the railway line ascends steadily from Puteaux, close to what is now La Défense, which you can just see in that modern photograph, through the woods around Saint-Cloud. However, it's clear that, although there were pockets of industrialisation along the river in the valleys, these little towns or large villages must have been esteemed for their separateness and clearer country air, beyond damp and smog, and susceptible to the role of cleansing winds. The same is true of places beloved of other artists. Both Pontoise and Auvers-sur-Oise are not dissimilar distances from the centre of the capital, and they were valued for their attractive smallness, picturesque appearances, and similarly rural surrounds by both Pissarro and Van Gogh, and they certainly would not have thought of them as primarily suburban places. There's another problem too in thinking of Sisley in this way. The simple fact is that if you leaf through the complete catalogue of his roughly 1,080 authenticated works, the vast majority are of the open countryside or riverside. A sample of 500 suggests this is about 66%, divided between 22% countryside and 44% waterside. Towns and villages feature significantly, and he clearly enjoyed the fascinating varieties of buildings and their order, and often their age. Yet these studies are only about 21% of the sample, and some are groups of farm buildings rather than village streets. So that, in fact, reflecting waters and their varying lights, trees, meadows, paths, and skies dominate. Yet all those very specific and recurrent place names in the catalogue titles remind us of the importance of location, and very often of particular village streets and buildings, or houses and gardens. The Impressionists seem all acutely concerned with the specificity of location and the accuracy of its evocation. One of the most interesting revelations about Sisley that became apparent in visiting the places in which he lived and worked is how intensely local his selection of subjects was. In fact, it is true of so many of the artists of the period, but you actually have to walk their landscapes to appreciate it fully. Given the era in which they lived and the constraints on their spending, these limits ought not to be surprising. Yet when you read critics writing about the painter's selections of motif, implying that there was something rather agonising about the process, the obvious ease with which Sisley and his peers found their subjects is very amusing. At Voisin, a hamlet on the outer roads of Lucienne, where he settled at the turn of the Rue de la Princesse, near the junction with the Rue de la Machine, to capture the pollarded trees and straight road on which the little Palais des Eaux backed one winter, he had to walk no further than 600 yards. Perhaps that distance again along the descending path, taking him from the ridge overlooking the valley to the site of a verdant cottage, once a workshop for a royal engineering project, which gave him the chance to view the distance from a lower angle. Today, sadly, only its ruins remain. When he lived at Marly-le-Roi from 1875, in the house on the corner of a semicircular area, it no longer exists, but it was just there, that's the plaque they kept near it, in front of the great watering place for the king's horses, he painted the locale no fewer than 17 times, sometimes from his bedroom window. It's not a particularly attractive architectural intervention in the landscape, I think you'd agree, but its appeal to Sisley was the broad openness of the area and the clarity with which different seasons made their impact. At Sèvres, from 1877 to 80, he is repeatedly haunting the nearby Seine riverbank, as he does the River Loing at its junction with it from 1880. The medieval town of Moret-sur-Loing, with its fascinating bridge over the river, provided numerous motifs, while the church, which he studied in detail no fewer than 12 times, was literally just around the corner from his home in the Rue de Montmartre. Those delightful groupings of buildings of the town were achieved by a stroll of maybe less than 100 yards or less than half a mile over the bridge to the other side of the river. Not more than 2 miles away stands the village of Saint-Mamet, at the confluence of the Loing and the Seine, the banks of which provided him with innumerable viewpoints, subjects and moments of pause and stillness. Reeds, barges, aqueducts, railway bridges, houses, rows of cottages, wide expanses of water, all have their contribution to make. And this stretch, I reckon, he painted 120 times. As I said, he's not alone in these immediacies, which seem to speak of the compulsive, if not addictive nature of the artist. They must have something to paint. You couldn't get any closer than Van Gogh's bedroom in the Yellow House at Arles, Pissarro's Paris rainy boulevards from a hotel window where he was staying, Monet's own garden at Véteuil and Cézanne's Jardin de Buffon. But they remind us too of the limits imposed and willingly accepted by artists of the 19th century who had to rely on their own 2 legs, like so many of their equally poor fellow workers, to take them to work. One other aspect that has struck me too is that in their depiction of work and in industrial activity, sometimes lighting on similar subjects, as with these depictions of riverside sand moving by Sisley and Van Gogh, they did not share our negative modern reactions to encountering it in what we might consider a potentially picturesque setting. They rarely seem disturbed, as we have come to be, by warehouses or factory chimneys. There's no sense that a bridge and a railway are either some kind of violation of a sentimental idyll. Engineering and technology are something of a cause of pride or even excitement. They're buildings and engines, simply modern matters of fact, and in some cases, more locally to Sisley, vast and remarkable historical ones. All that is part of the work done in the 17th century to bring water from the Seine up to the fountains, at first at the palace at Marly and then at Versailles itself. Throughout the years of steady production, Sisley's fortunes ebbed and flowed, and I'm not going to detail every exhibition and sale or failure to sell. Suffice it to say that things were particularly strained for him in the late 70s and early and mid-80s. He was perhaps most consistently supported by the dealer Paul Durand-Ruel, who on occasions even picked up the bill for his annual rent. But even he had his purchasing power constrained by the market, in which he was trying to sell the stock he had so generously built up. A change of loyalty by Sisley to another dealer by the name of Petit, at the time Durand-Ruel had in fact recovered and was expanding his business, was seriously misjudged. And in these later years, friends found a certain amount of bitterness and melancholy in his isolated struggles that clouded the memories of the formerly charming companion whose work continued to be unjustly neglected. Once described as brighter than a chaffinch, one whose witty sallies had produced ripples of laughter at gatherings of artists at dinner, he's rather sadly described at the end of his life as being bereft of all joys except the joy of painting, which never left him. One of his patrons, a man who doubled being an entertainer of artists along with being a collector and a writer and a famous pastry cook, a man by the name of Moret, actually esteemed Sisley above Monet, describing him as the most subtle of impressionists with the soul and brush of a poet, a person with the cast of mind of a Frenchman and the correctness of a gentleman. And perhaps it is that sense of subtlety, restraint and slight detachment that helps him achieve his finest work. But there was also his unerring sense at other times of the innate vitality of what he saw before him. In a review of what we now call the Second Impressionist Exhibition, the poet Stéphane Mallarmé expressed it like this: Sisley seizes the passing moments of the day, watches a fugitive cloud and seems to paint it in its flight. On his canvas the live air moves and the leaves yet thrill and tremble. Towards the end of his life, Sisley discussed with Adolphe Tavernier, the art critic and collector, what he called the animation of the canvas. He said that to give life to the work of art is certainly one of the most necessary tasks of the true artist. Everything must serve this end: form, colour, surface. It was about surface that he felt very strongly, and he put it like this: I am in favour of a variation of surface within the same picture. This does not correspond with contemporary opinion, but I believe it to be correct, particularly when it is a question of rendering a light effect, because when the sun lets a certain part of the landscape appear soft, it lifts others into sharp relief. These effects of light, which have an almost material expression in nature, must be rendered in material fashion on the canvas. Such concern is notable in his later works of the 80s and 90s, was actually expressed in that quotation on his tombstone, if you remember back to the very beginning. At Moret, at this time, Christopher Lloyd, the critic, asserted that we find Sisley at the height of his powers as he singles out the riverbanks, the bridge and the church as those studies that show him summoning the experience of the previous decades. He admires the clear sense that the works were completed in one speedy session and notes the more richly applied paint with more pronounced thickness in pastel than previously, the more insistently rhythmical brushwork and the vibrancy of the colours. He believes that the technical skills in these finer works match with his undoubted compositional powers, in which he sees echoes of Corot and Monet. Tavernier, who gave the oration at Sisley's funeral, summed him up as a magician of light, a poet of the heavens, the waters, of the trees. In a word, one of the most remarkable landscapists of his day. And that is how he would have wished his work to be seen, at face value, as landscape pure and simple. Others, also writing after his death, placed him squarely as a significant figure in a historical continuum of French landscape painting. It's interesting how often the word poet appears in evaluations of his work. Roger Fry, poet and playwright himself, reviewing an exhibition in 1927, described him as an artist of pure sensibility. And the point is often made that the Impressionists were not interested in the visual impression alone, but in capturing too the wider atmospheric, in the broadest sense of the word, and the emotional dimension of the view of them before them at any one particular moment. Now, you've already seen along the way in this discussion a number of Sisley canvases, and to continue the discussion, I'd like to share more. My difficulty has been in how to select and to arrange them. The obvious choice was in relation to place of residence, but that would mean that each selection would prove to be for a very similar time. I've chosen instead to select by subject matter or motif, which allows you perhaps to identify for yourselves greater contrasts that become apparent over the years of his activity. Let's start with a number of studies of open country. In this early painting of 1865, one of the few survivors of that earlier era, of trees in a rocky landscape near La Selle Saint-Cloud, it is at 1 1/3 metres by 2, far larger than later work. That's about 6 foot by 4 feet, and suggests its ambition was for the salon. And while it has very methodical solidity and weight, the brushwork of the sky and of the foreground suggests the lively and energetic Sisley that is to come. He uses the fall of direct light and shadow to anchor the central line of the picture, and that's characteristic of him, and particularly of his handling of trees. The contrast with the painting of the wheat field near Argenteuil some 5 years later could not be stronger. The selection of view is much less formal, aided by the variety of crops and groups of trees at different distances. The whole has a greater brilliancy, and the brushstrokes are larger and looser in direction in the sky. The foreground and the increasing detail of the wheat and vegetable crop has much greater energy in colour and application. The same is true of a similar varied group of crops from a couple of years later. Sisley again making the most of lines, drawing one into the depths of the picture towards the support for some vines, and two characters apparently looking at activity undertaken by workers in the land beyond the 2 trees in the distance. In the small meadows in spring at B of some 6 years later, although we have a path hinting that the eye follow it, the demands of the sun-struck bare trees in a not dissimilar colour on either side of it call our attention to them in the detail of their branches and the early leafing bushes at their base. Fragments of more trees intrude at the right edge beneath the second block of less obscured cloudy sky. The grass and plants underfoot are delineated with curved strikes of subtle colour which soften towards the distance. While the river is present here, it does not dominate this canvas. One of the largest human figures he ever depicted is the young woman there, who we believe is his daughter. While he was in Paris in 1870, he was drawn, as we saw, to water and not often to the Seine itself, but the Canal Saint-Martin. We've already seen one image of it in which it is the capacity for broad shimmering reflections that are the attraction. In this second, the draw is the business of the working waterway. That's what matters most. The white and brown barges with their angular rudders and their tenders dominate the scene. A winter wind ruffles the surface of the water, the darker shades of which echo the trampled and wet fallen leaves of the towpath. In the middle distance to the right, a group of men gather. The industrial buildings are more dominant than the distant residential blocks. The viewpoint is low and narrow. Compare that urban piece with this view of the Seine at Bougival of 2 years later. Here we have a tranquil idyll with only one boat pottering along. Calm sky, reflection, delivered with even, soft, square brushstrokes of similar quality across the whole canvas. The technique, however, becomes very different by the time he is doing these views of the Loing at Saint-Mamet in 1889, where the overgrown riverbank with its reeds is treated with a staccato energy, while the sky and the houses are each distinguished by different methods of applying the paint again. 9 years later, a different section of the river, with its wide sky, banks water plants and trees shows the different techniques used for each element, from light scumbling of the sky to the varying but more paint-loaded larger strokes of the bank and water surface, and the stabbing patterns of the tree leaves to the left-hand side in the distance. Each shows how these elements of his method have been individually strengthened and developed. Rivers are, of course, often marked by human presence more strongly, and Sisley's studies of bridges and their adjacent settlements take full advantage of those constructions and their environs. Two from the early 1870s are not dissimilar in composition, though they are very much so in colour. At both Villeneuve-la-Garenne and Hampton Court, the angular perspective of the road bridges and the geometry of their design intervene boldly at the left of the picture, and there is a similarity in the method creating the ripple and the reflection. Perhaps aware of these repetitions, Sisley also adopted an extraordinary bold point of view of the same Hampton Court bridge, into which two double sculls are seen entering from the left. Despite the cool shade of the looming bridge, we're made aware of the insistently bright day beyond. A more muted scene of 7 years later uses the angled bridge as a device once more, but the most noteworthy thing about this view of the bridge at Saint-Mamès is the low horizon, the tonal, its chalky pink and grey central line with the lilac-hued sky above the church tower. A single red roof arrests our vision to the right of the image. Finally, this slightly later work of 1893, which feels as if it is taken from an upper window in one of the old stone warehouses which stand on our side of the bridge. It is framed to allow the buildings of the mill and of the town to dominate, partly so that their surfaces can allow the strong summer's sun power to radiate. It's worth taking a moment to look at the contrasting patterns and directions of brushstrokes in the sky, in the contrasting stone surfaces of the bridge in the shade and the buildings in the light, the water surface and the reeds. A few walkers and a laden cart brave the still heat of the height of the day, which casts their shadows almost beneath their feet. Today, by the side of the river on one of the medieval buildings is a marker which records the heights of various floods over the last 3 centuries. And if you want drama in depicting rivers, floods are just the thing, and the rise of the water level extraordinary. That is the mark of the 1876 flood, which was the one that was most important to Sisley, although at the time he was working upriver a bit, downriver a bit. Raised water levels on the Loing do produce interestingly turbulent effects, as you can see from March of this year. But I feel it was not the frothy churn of water that most interested Sisley. In fact, he only seems to have given that his attention in his final painting foray on the Welsh coast in 1897. So it was not here during his later time in the Moret area, but early on at the Seine and at and around Port-Marly in 1872 and 76 that Sisley captured the river in flood and its recession. Although modern changes in the control of navigation along the river make an accurate judgment difficult, it looks as if the river had risen at least 15 feet above its normal course. Yet what he gives us is less drama than a strange sense of acceptance and serenity. In this painting, The Ferry to the Ile de la Loge, the ferry appears to be bravely operating still, guided by the cable between the two stanchions. The triangular mass on our side offering, however, no real place of safety or dryness despite its solidity and its reflection. The stiller surface of the deeply flowing water beyond is like a mirror. The lower cloudy light again assists a beautiful harmony of muted variations of soft creams and greys. The tiled roofs and trees of the middle and far distance share a similar tone. It is an exactly held moment. When the floods returned 4 years later, he set himself up close to buildings he had captured before. This is a painting from the 72 flood. Now, whether it is by chance or, as I suspect, something of an almost unspoken official desire to preserve the motifs that the high point of Impressionism had immortalised, those buildings are very much still there, though as a cafe rather than as a wine merchant. There is this rather more oblique view captured in the 76 series on a bright day, which gives prominence to the building and its architectural detail, especially at roof and chimney level. The small pollarded trees nearby and the distant taller ones seem especially fragile against that rearing mass. But the reflections in the floodwater almost give that a solidity too. Our eye is drawn to the dark hull and figures by the door of the shop, and to another boat passing, strangely of course, between the trees. The tall open sky and prevailing brightness minimise the sense of danger. The more threatening cloudscape and a more direct view of this elevation, almost as if an architect's plan, allows the flood here to appear broader and less confined. We get a full sense of its extent in the right-hand 2/3 of the canvas, divided neatly by firstly the edge of the building and then the standing telegraph poles. This time, the figures active with their boats appear in the shallower, more protected areas of the streets. And yet over both images hangs an air of acceptance rather than panic, as if people had been adequately prepared. The walkway in front of the shop, of planks placed on crates or barrels or bricks in one image, is clearly always ready to be pressed into service. Now, the importance of buildings in many of these riverside paintings brings us to two groups of work with which to conclude. Our first is of views of streets and buildings, again taken from the 70s, 80s and 90s. This painting, probably from the very late summer or early autumn of 1872 or 3, is of his house at Voisin, at the end of the Rue de la Princesse in Lucienne. Our eyes drawn to the evening brightness of the distant hills, towards which the closest walker and a very relaxed military rider are heading. The brushwork with which the road, house walls and foliage have been laid in has a very soft edge, the latter capturing dappled light. There's a strong sense of balance in the composition overall. We find another white horse. Maybe that's a challenge, find a horse in Sisley that's not white. Another white horse in the broad depiction of the watering place at Marly-le-Roi of 1875, where it has been ridden in for a drink. It always amazes me how effectively Sisley can create motion, shapes and dress with the slightest dabs of paint. This powerful animal is clearly being held in on a tight rein. The stone walls of the abreuvoir are given a finer detailing than the houses. The feed of water to the lower tank produces circular ripples to the right, which frame the reflections of the higher trees on the hill. They're balanced by those on the other side of the street, which are reflected in an entirely different pattern. But it's the lively, cloudy sky that demands the loosest and lightest of brushwork. Sky and reflection here, when you think about it, probably occupy about 60% of the whole image. 10 years later, amid a long sequence of riverside paintings of Saint-Mamès with their houses in the middle distance, we find an exceptional close-up of a farm. In getting on for a metre wide, or roughly 3'1", it's unusually large. In fact, if you consider the size of canvas that Sisley uses over time, you might share my sense that he approaches the larger canvas in a slightly different frame of mind, with, if you like, a settled ambition in ways that are not so obviously apparent in small works. It's a quite exceptional study that immediately involves the eye, not only with the worn path and the arch and the view of the river beyond it, but with the detail of texture, and finally the 4 figures, apparently of rush weavers, contained within it. The tiled roofs, the wooden balcony, have all been the subject of the most thorough and spirited treatment. It is a wonderful achievement. At a similar time, he's capable of this very fine autumnal study of the Rue des Fosses in Moret. When you grasp its relatively small dimensions, 46 centimetres wide, just over 1'6", it's half the size of the big farmyard at Saint-Mamère. You can appreciate the size of the confident brushstrokes, capturing a sense of movement in the leaves on the trees, again masterfully differentiated by light and shadow. And you can see too how he uses both light and shadow falling on the whitewashed buildings in the background to make our eye move from the rather blank walls to the left that throw the detail of the gateway into relief, finally involving us in the distant architectural detail of windows, dormers and chimneys once again. Architectural structure is again a preoccupation in his famous sequence of paintings of the church at Moret from 1893 to 4, the tower of which had long appeared above his riverside landscapes. We find him fully in command of brush and palette in producing the finest effects of light, hour, season and weather on stone and street. The decorative details of the facade, the glimpses of the tower, of the covered market and road, all seen in slightly different perspectives and lights and weathers, and with different shadow patterns absorb our attention. And it is in these pictures that he demonstrates the benefit of using paint's often textural quality to enhance the depiction. The thick application gives the walls the same rough solidity of those in the farmyard painting, while similarly the skies are often treated more thinly unless they portend rain, as they clearly do here. And I think the image can just capture the thickness of the painting on that depiction of sky. It's time to conclude, seasonally, with a selection of winter snow scenes. Not from across the decades, but from the very snowy winters of the 1870s. These scenes are motifs which the Impressionists as a group became well known, and indeed, why would you not take artistic advantage of a succession of hard winters to challenge your own skills of representation? 2 types of claim are made for these types of scene quite often. Frequent references to the circulation of Japanese prints as influential, and the idea that the Impressionists established the snow scenes firmly in the canon of European painting. Now, the first is of interest, but I can't believe that painters so committed to light and landscape really needed either license or inspiration in approaching the subject, although some compositional ideas may have been suggested by the foreign prints to a degree. Secondly, there's already, as we know through Dutch painting, a tradition of snow and ice depiction fully established in Europe, not to forget, as art historians are often wont to do, the Scandinavian and Russian contribution that were contemporaries of the Impressionists. The numerousness of paintings of this type by the Impressionists is simply an expression of their delighted experience of the weather at the time. Nothing, remember, would stop them painting. They were addicts. And consider how you reach for your camera when the weather turns wintry. In their performance, I see very little self-consciousness about it at all. Let's start with this street scene of Lucienne from 1872. Sisley's earliest view of the place, with its remnants of an early form. There's considerable softness again in the brushwork we've seen in early paintings, in the sky and trees, but especially in the snow, the road and the gutter surfaces, the paint is loaded a bit more heavily on the brush. The figures have a real sense of being local. I rather love this chap. I think it's just popped out from the local bakers. The white roofs behind them are central to the painting as they are central to their existence. The subject of the next work we've seen before, the watering place at Marly-le-Roi. The water is now frozen and the landscape transformed by snow and ice. In this painting of 1875, the sunset just seen beyond the trees of the park lends the pink hue. The watering place beyond the bollards is foreshortened as we look up to the wall of the terrace at the very edge of the park itself. Sisley's sort of turning to the right-hand road from the area in front of the great open water area. Sisley's exactitude of depiction is exemplified by the way that that last light is caught in the upper branches of the tree to left of the house and in the lowest cloud in the gap to the right. The fading of the snow in the middle of the road and the jumbled nature of it down by the bollards, its absence from the trees itself, all tell us that this was a fall of a day or two ago. Another painting from the same cold winter is something of a rarity in works by Sisley, the depiction of a whole settlement, here Lucienne. The foreground has its three male figures huddled with their hands in their pockets, and they're clearly feeling the cold and looking forward to getting out of it. The walls and blank white rectangles of roof map out the foreground quite simply, rather like the Rue de Fosse at Moret autumnal painting. But over the walls and the frosted trees, the spire of the church is the lowest of the three descending points. The two to its right being those very characteristic tall French poplars. There's again an impressive economy of stroke and exactitude of depiction of the gathered houses that once more occupy the very centre of the composition, that lie beyond the zigzagging snow-capped walls and the frosted orchards. Once again, a sombre sky, though brighter towards the north, casts a muted light over the whole. For a still and frozen day, the painting contains a great deal of engagement for the viewer standing before it. Now, Sisley, as we have seen, also enjoys the opportunities provided by a close view, and this is true of this well-known study of the Chemin de l'Attaché in Voisin shortly after a very heavy fall. There's a weighted sombreness to the overcast sky, drawn partly from the ochre ground on which the whole was painted. Again, the range of colour from the palette has been drawn right in and is very limited, and the application of the paint in places has something of the heavy quality of its subject. There's an interest in the way the strong perspective lines are delivered and divided with the different boundary types. To the left, there's a fence, and beyond it, a very finished, solid ashlar wall with its occasional darker ochre stones. To the right, there's a much rougher rubble wall, and that has captured more readily the falling driven snow. A slight mistiness intervenes in the air before the buildings and trees on the rise. The snow on the ground below is beginning to be trodden by the locals into an easier path. The trees balancing the composition on either side seem almost overwhelmed by their burden, their branches tense and bent under it, appearing almost like springs. Such effects are visible in another painting of the same time. It's a difficult day, but the solitary figures walk purposefully away from us homewards. And that is where we too must head before long. Inevitably, I've only been able to give you a fragment of the work of this finest of artists. If you are lucky, as you pass through the great art galleries of the world, you might be able to see some 2 or 3 or 4 of his paintings in many. The places in which he worked remain, for the most part, remarkably unchanged at heart, largely skirted by the motorised world rather than pierced by it, as attractive in appearance as they were when he lived there. And perhaps on an autumn afternoon, or a brilliant summer's morning, or a frosty day, there, or wherever you are, you will be able to share and enjoy a similar serene view, and appreciate serene views as he most certainly did the place of light.
Even I know that word. Oh, that's fantastic, John. Thank you so much. Who needs the Royal Academy when we've got John? I know it wasn't not the originals, but you know, if any of you have been to retrospectives of impressionist paintings at the Royal Academy or somewhere like that, there's thousands of people there, and you're trying to see the paintings, and you don't get this wonderful commentary at the same time. So thank you very much, John. It's the first time I've seen that as well. So, while we have some time for questions, if any are bubbling up, Aaron is first. Aaron.
I'm always first. Thank you very much, John. That was my mum's an artist, and when she painted with oil paint, it took forever, weeks sometimes. So, do you know how long it took him to do a picture? Because obviously you paint the scene in front of you, that's fine. But then you've got the moving bits, like a person who'll be there for 5 minutes, maybe, and then they're gone. So does he sketch it out quickly and remember it? Or
Yeah, I think.
And the same with the light. Because the light, if he sat there all day, the light and the mood is going to change.
Yes, absolutely. I think you have to make a decision and go for it.
Right.
The theory is, all the writers who write about him suggest that he always started with the sky.
Yeah.
So in a sense that captures what happens in front of it. Looking at some of the paintings closely, I'm not 100% sure that's always true. I think he does alter the sky around things, particularly that one of the pollarded trees in the Rue de la Machine, that you can see where he's kind of filled in a bit as things have changed. How long did he spend on a painting? I mean, how long does a piece of as long as it's necessary. I mean, I've always wondered how on earth, you get these wet paintings back home again. I mean, they're difficult to transport. You may have noticed on some of the paintings, there's a slightly darker edge around them, because a number of the pictures that I took were from things that have been in the catalogue. And in the catalogue, they always remove the frames before they photograph them. So that the bits under the edge of the frame are sometimes a bit muckier or less complete than the rest. So obviously when they were first done, they weren't always painted right to the edge of the canvas. So there's some way of holding them without mucking them all up as well. But I also wonder about, how long can you sit out in a freezing snowy day and complete it? The painting of Louvciennes with the half-gone snowfall, that first one with the baker in it, that's one of the few paintings in which there's a complete sketch of exactly the same view in existence. Generally, he used either sort of a bit of really sort of purpley navy paint on a very thin brush to do the framework of the painting, or some dark, I think some charcoal, very lightly, and then moved on. He doesn't seem to have done a drawing, returned to the studio, because that's the thing. You draw with your paint, really. So, a couple of hours, 2 to 3 hours, I don't know. Some paintings you see that he worked on much more quickly than others. And some paintings, I'm going to show you this, some paintings are not as good as others. And I'm going to show you one that I think, although some people write about this quite nicely, I think this is simply awful. Because, you know, that looks like a sketch to me. And there's very little differentiation. I know it's quite small, but there's little differentiation in these sort of heaps and midden heaps, and it's another farmyard. But you compare the quality of the farmyard at Saint-Mamet to that one. It's just the opposite side of the riverbank, this one. But that is just a sketch, and it doesn't deserve to have the same esteem as some of the other paintings. I put that one in because, you know, not all artists hit the mark all the time, and some things which might happily have been lost aren't always lost.
Just go back to the previous slide, to that one.
Yes.
That's it, yes. Just wondered, can you say anything about that one?
Well, I was particularly fond of that one. Simply, I mean, again, it's typical in as much as he likes the way light will fall from one direction and give a warmth to those buildings. And I think I like the casualness of that, you know, the work on whatever that is it a farm, is it a small factory, I'm not sure, that things have actually just stopped in their tracks because of that. He's good at snow surfaces. There's one I didn't include, which is almost entirely a bank of a fairly sort of rough road covered in snow that's half melted, and it's absolutely wonderful. Maybe I should have put that in. Sorry.
Yes, sorry. Thanks very much. A really interesting talk and many beautiful paintings. But I was thinking, without you having told us, I'd have a lot of problem identifying, is that a Sisley, a Monet, a Pissarro, a Renoir? I mean, what is it in particular that you think would, without reading the name of
yes,
that's a Sisley.
I think it's probably, certainly in the later ones, there's a much greater difference in the treatment of different parts of the canvas. I mean, there's some aspects of the later ones that it'll take a while to get back, but in one of the ones of the river, we'll get there in a moment. Sorry, yeah, that one. I'm not sure. I like the stabby nature of the leaves on the trees there. So what identifies them particularly, I think it's the fact that it's the similarity of subject matter, and you can kind of identify them because of knowing where he lived. Yeah. And there are lots of the canal. There are lots of the where the river joins, and they do fit fairly exactly into. They fit exactly into his biography, if you like. Yeah. But in terms of technique, I mean, that's a fair comment.
Yeah,
I
so
mean,
it's just sort of putting everything together.
Yeah. I mean, and I think one of the reasons he is considered less interesting, perhaps, is that, I mean, you probably aware that the Pissarro actually had a big period where he suddenly thought, I'm getting a bit old-fashioned, let me try something new. And he joined in with the pointillist, the sort of the Seurat, and he had to go at that for a long while. Yeah. And he was also thinking, well, you know, I don't want to just do landscapes. So there were all those lovely paintings of the market and people at the stalls and so on. And figure painting became more important. I mean, Sisley, I haven't included any, but Sisley did do in the whole work, there are probably something like 12 or 13 still lives. And they are very fine, but it's not his thing. There are two interiors. One of his boy and girl working at a table, doing their homework, and another one of the inside of a forge at Lucienne. But interiors were not him either. So it was very much the outdoorsy
Did he do? I think you only showed 2 in England at Hampton Court.
Oh, right,
Given that
yes.
he was British. Did he come to England and do more?
He had 3 painting campaigns in the British Isles. He intended to have one in the Isle of Wight, but unfortunately he was on his uppers when he arrived there, and all the stuff he'd arranged to be sent from France that he could work on, his colours and his canvases, never turned up. There's stories of him waiting on the end of Ryde Pier, looking out to see, hoping that something would happen. So he could then go over to Allen Bay and paint cliffs there. Well, that was a disaster. The Hampton Court paintings are wonderful. I think in the publicity that David put around, there's that big painting of Molesley Lock near Hampton Court, and there are lots of scenes of regattas and Victorian regatta with oarsmen on the river, and they're kind of bright and open and sunny and flying flags and all the rest of it. So that was a second campaign, and they're very summary, very sort of full of energy and life. And the bridge was perhaps the most staid of those, but he liked the activity on the water. And then the third campaign in the British Isles, I was asked if he was a religious man. As it happened, when he got married in a registry office. So he actually got married in Cardiff Registry Office. And I think, sadly, because his wife was already ill by that time, and he wanted to regularise the children. So they got in touch with the French consul. They signed an acknowledgement of their children to the French consul. Then they went, because he wasn't French, and it was easier for him to get married civilly in Cardiff Registry Office. I'm sure, given that Cardiff now has a magnificent city hall, I'm sure it's all been demolished now. But then they went down the coast to Langland Bay, and sort of near Gower Peninsula, I think. And he did lots of, which he hadn't ever done before, beach scenes and scenes of the sea looking over towards across the Bristol Channel, the roads of Cardiff, and the harbours there.
Is that what you showed near the end?
Yeah, with the rock,
Yeah.
and the sea splashing over it. But that was his, and in fact, I think those paintings, and he went there partly because one of his patrons was prepared to sponsor his trip. Otherwise, I don't think he would, at that time in his life, he was really in financial difficulties. And I think he sent his sponsor a kind of a postcard with a sketch of the sitting room in the hotel that he was able to stay in. But I think those 1897 paintings, they're the last in the catalogue. When he got back, looking after Eugénie, and then his own illness, he wasn't able to find time for all painting.
I'll get to you, Eric, but let's go to Nigel next.
So apologies to what is clearly a knowledgeable audience here. John, that painting where there was the sudden snowfall that had partially melted,
Yeah.
I noticed the trees were heavy with foliage. It looks almost, if I'm not mistaken, as if it was a sudden snowfall, sort of catching the village unawares. Am I right in that?
We'll find it. Not that one.
Previous one.
Go back and come.
Back.
It's the high.
Again.
Next one. The one with the bakery.
Yeah.
The trees are heavy with leaves.
Yes, so you're right. Yes. It must be well spotted.
So early snowfall.
Yes, it must be an end of autumn.
Yeah. And the other one, again with apologies to the audience, when a painter painting on plein air, temperatures in the summer, the high 20s, early 30s, and their materials, particularly the oils, will be quite loose. Whereas in the winter, how does the low temperatures, because they'd be sub-zero, affect the oils with which they're working?
My sense is, I've never painted on plein air, my sense is that oil paints will freeze much less readily than water will. So I think that the oil will maintain the viscosity, and you can thin it, and you can sort of mix it a bit more. I mean, I'm not sure how temperature would affect it. I've never done an experiment with it, but I am amazed at the way they stick at it, because clearly they did stick at it in some quite uncongenial conditions. Although it's fair to say that post-snow, it can be relatively mild,
Yes.
rather than incredibly.
They have
freezing.
limited hours of daylight too, which
Yes. Eric.
Going over what you said just now about painting out of doors in all sorts of weather, and looking at the photographs you've shown, especially of that building on the corner, and how it appeared in his paintings, he must have spent a lot of time actually on site, rather than just sketching. I mean, so many painters, they would sketch and they'd have it in their head, and they go back into the studio and they put it on canvas there. But so many of them, all the way through your talk, the detail there comparatively to what it is he must have spent a lot of time actually, as you say, whether it's in the snow, whether it's in the sunshine, whatever it's in, doing it, you know.
Yes. And there's a sense of it being a settled view when you look at those things. That's what you're.
Well, everything. I mean, there's no great movement, there's no rush, there's no anything like that in it. It is as though he said, right, I'm going to spend the whole day doing it, or a week, or whatever it might be. And he goes out and he sits there, and he's got his food, he's got his flask of coffee or whatever it might be, and that's it for the day. Yes,
I think you're right. I mean, he finds a comfortable position, which isolates a good view for him.
But also what's interesting is the age he was doing it in, photography was already very active.
Yes.
And I've often wondered how many painters of an era, or of that era, say from 1850 to 1900, would have actually had a camera with them, taking the, not completely falsifying it in the way of their painting, but actually taking photographs that actually record what's there, and then to spend a certain amount of time actually doing the sketching and so on and so forth, and then back in the studio, and you've got a print of the photo of the photograph to work off.
That's an interesting one. I can't answer that question.
No.
I don't know. I mean, I'm always conscious of the fact that when I was in art lessons at school, teachers used to be really snooty about copying photographs. And there is a kind of prejudice, isn't there? But you're right, the development of this technology
That's
was
right.
something you thought you might
And also the Impressionist era really was the last era of painting before photography took hold. And photography became the method of record, rather than painting became the method of record. I mean, if you look at Constable, and so you will take the Hayway for example. I mean, that's a perfect record of a cart going through a river. The detail is there, absolutely everything. You could actually go and look at it, and there are the horses, the harness, etc. And then photography took over, and then painting had to do something different, and I think that's why Impressionism and Pointillism and so on came in, because it was being attacked by photography, and then the painters had to do something different, because they weren't recording reality anymore, and they had to make a living, so what did they do? Oh, we're going to do this instead.
I mean, it's interesting that in a number of the books about Sisley, particularly when they're dealing with towns and villages, they actually, alongside the paintings, they include tourist black and white photographs, the tourist postcards that were black and white photographs from exactly the same era alongside them. And again, he was lucky to find these places that were inherently picturesque.
Oh yes, thank you.
Now, do we have any more questions? Yes, Debbie.
I'm currently reading about Europe's most prolific art thief, who stole purely for pleasure. If you were going to steal one of Sisley's paintings, which one would you?
Well, I've always loved that one.
Yeah.
Because I just like the energy of it. I mean, I know there's a kind of, there's an inaccuracy in those trees, but I love just the weight of the snow and the sense of this figure.
Drawing you
sort
down.
of, yes, solidly kind of walking home. And I don't know if you spotted in some of the larger landscapes, particularly the riverside ones, there's always someone. I put one up the other day and I thought, there's no one in that one. And then I took a little moment and, oh no, there's someone actually coming out of the door in the hut by the side of the river. And it'd be foolish to say that there's nobody in his landscapes, but that sense that the landscapes are something that are brought to realisation by the presence of human beings, himself included, and that matters to him, I think. Yeah.
So that's the humanist bit, it's those tiny little figures. David?
I was just going to ask, where would you be able to see these paintings? Where are the most of them? In galleries in France or UK?
I mean, in an enormous amount. I mean, it's amazing how widely dispersed they are. Funnily enough, despite, I mean, I think it was 1897, there were a number of impressionists at that time that had some retrospectives, which turned out to be very successful. Sisley had one that was a complete failure, and it really added to his sort of melancholy. But by the turn of the century, Americans in particular were showing an interest in Sisley's work. Durand was one of the first of the dealers from Europe who actually organised exhibitions in New York and so on. So there's a lot in America. There are numbers in German galleries. The National has 4 here, of which at the moment only one is on display, I think. So they are very, very widely scattered. I don't know which museum has the largest collection. There are a lot in private hands. If you follow the series, what's it called, The Fatal Fortune? There was one episode, I think it was in an early series, on a painting that someone claimed was a Sisley, and there was a lot of work done on it, but it was considered, it was probably contemporary, but it was not. They decided it was not him. The current catalogue, the 59 catalogue wasn't very complete. The current catalogue is pretty thorough, but that wasn't something, I didn't think of that. I mean, I could tell you where the most Pissarros are if you wanted to see. It's locally. If you go to Rouen, you'll see lots of Pissarros, but it tends to be quite small numbers. It's scattered around lots and lots of museums. Yeah. Aaron?
A follow-up to David's question, when the group in here get together and steal this picture for you, would you need that as an original, or would a print be completely okay with you? What frame would you choose to go with that picture?
Yes. Well, that, again, you can see that one's been photographed out of its frame. I know what you mean, because whenever you go to art galleries, everything has a gold frame around it that's quite elaborate. I mean, and gold frames which are basically from a pattern from the 18th or early 19th century, irrespective. So, to be honest, if you didn't have a gold frame around them, you'd now find that distracting. Because we are so used to going to galleries and seeing that kind of frame on a painting. If there was, you would double take and you'd be distracted by it. So there's something to be said for having the traditional gallery frame, because you notice it less.
So the lovely IKEA frames we have on the wall behind you there.
Well, yes. It probably wouldn't be a black frame. I mean, I think there's something to be said for, to be honest, for the canvas, but that's always considered a bit like, dancing around in your underwear. I mean, it's yeah.
And would it have to be an original, or would you just buy it as a print okay these days?
Well, if you're going to offer me a choice between an original and something from Athena, I think oh, sorry, does Athena exist? No, it doesn't. Sorry, showing our age. I think I'd go for the original.
Do you know what the most recent one sold for?
No, I haven't looked that up lately, but I'm sure someone can get their phone out and find out fairly quickly now. I don't know, but I mean, if you can spend $6.4 million on a banana and a piece of duct tape, you'd rather hope that Sisley was honoured properly when he comes to market. Although, I mean, to be honest, the art market is just so distorted and so silly nowadays that you feel rather depressed. But particularly when you consider these people couldn't pay the butcher's bill from one year to the end to the next. Oh, there is a letter from Sisley saying, well, you couldn't send me, $200, 200 francs. I haven't paid the butcher for over a year, we feel sorry for vegetarians.
Why wasn't he granted French citizenship?
He nearly was. The papers had actually, funnily enough, been approved, but then he made the mistake of dying. So it's never regularised. I mean, in a sense, in those days, I don't think it mattered. So it was of no real consequence.
How old was he when he died?
59.
Do you know what he died of? Was it just...
Yeah, he had. I mean, it's really tragic. I mean, his wife died of cancer of the tongue, and he died about 18 months later of cancer of the throat.
I didn't notice.
With not much medical.
Taking too many brushes.
I don't know. I suspect it's probably smoking.
Yes. The first picture showed him with a cigarette.
Yeah. Yes.
Sally?
I'm just wondering why they took so long to get married, because it seems it would have been a lot more convenient if they got married at a much earlier stage. I mean, was it really sort of, to spite bourgeois convention, or what, that they didn't get married?
I don't know. I suspect they just genuinely didn't much care one way or the other. And I think that the idea with the marriage was to make some kind of security for their children in the end. Which, to be honest, if you only have 1,000 francs worth of furniture, doesn't seem worth bothering. But they did. But I think it was about, in a sense, their own. Well, I mean, at that crucial moment, I think actually it made that public commitment mattered. I think it was probably more to do with her illness and that sense of gratitude, because she was a good mum, and that sense of gratitude to her was probably the overriding motive, I would have thought. But she was always called Madame Sisley, even though she wasn't. I mean, nobody amongst their circle, nobody bothered much, to be honest.
Yes, it's just, okay, you were saying the family lost its money in whatever crisis it was back then, but it just seems, well, what a waste to sort of be estranged from your family because they didn't consider you respectable, but I mean, there may be all sorts of other reasons.
Yes. I think he did have an allowance from his dad, but then when the family business went belly up, and obviously the sense of shame of having children out of wedlock and so on, because they're obviously quite respectable bourgeois people, and they would have felt that as an embarrassment. But I think he felt it wasn't. His dad died in very reduced circumstances. His son, very sadly, according to newspaper reports, he actually died of starvation. I mean, he had made a moderate income for himself. He started as a sort of artist, but the last description of him was as a kind of decorator. but he fell on hard times, and I think that in the old days they said he died of self-neglect. So that was rather sad.
And what happened to the daughter?
Good question. Sorry, or at least let's say that detail's not fresh in my mind.
Can I just say, right at the beginning, you showed a picture of his father painted by Renoir.
Yes.
But how did that come about?
Well, they were. I mean, Sisley and Renoir were mates. Renoir was probably short of a bob or two. Dad was quite an established, elegant figure. So there was certainly that. It's true that Renoir painted, I think, members of Bazille's family as well. So it was a kind of a warm but undemeaning gesture. So there was a man with skill. We'd like some family pictures, and so family pictures were done, and some money was handed over at a useful time. And I think it's as simple as that.
Was it because he was British that he wasn't so well publicised, do you think, as the French impression?
That too is an interesting question, because I in going round all these villages and towns, very often in France you always get sort of école somewhere, and I didn't come across any écoles at Alfred Sisley. And I thought, oh, well, the French have obviously done it because he's British and they were English. But actually, I then Googled École Alfred Sisley, and there are about 6 of them around France. College Alfred Sisley. So I don't think there was a prejudice against him, because Pissarro was seen in the end, in terms of public popularity and income. Both Pissarro and he felt they were in the rear guard of the Impressionist movement. Both of them struggled.
Of course, Pissarro came to London.
Yeah.
That painting of his of the train in Chiswick.
Yes.
I lived in Chiswick, so I know exactly where that was.
And then his son came to England and stayed, and made his living as a engraver.
That very last painting you showed, which was very different from the other one, was quite brash, and the colours were very, very bold. It was almost like a broidal type of thing. Was he in fact changed in direction when he painted that?
Oh, the one we said wasn't very good?
The very last.
I don't think so. I mean,
it's almost broidal of Van Gogh, isn't it?
It's
in look.
It's much, and the colour is much. And I don't think it's the quality of the image, but there's much less differentiation. There's no depth and interest in a lot of the blocks of colour there. I think he would have just regarded that as a bit of a sketch.
But the actual sunlight is much brighter in it. I mean, with the blue sky, which you didn't see in any of the other ones.
Yes.
The others are all whitish or grey sky.
I mean, I've done my best to try and get pictures from various places where I probably shouldn't. To show you, and I'm never sure about the colour as it's presented. I mean, the only authentic colour is standing in front of the painting. If you look on the internet, you look. I mean, there are probably 6 or 7 images of the farmyard at Saint-Mémès, the one with the reed weavers in the courtyard, and every one of those has got a different level of brilliancy, a different level of colour saturation, and so on. So. I don't know. It is very difficult to be sure, to be honest.
You can't even be sure that the colour, if you go and stand in front of it, that's the colour it was when he painted it.
No, because there will be some variation if things aren't being in the light, or the colour man that he used on that particular week was not as good as someone else, and his colours have faded. Yes, that's true.
Aaron, you've got another question?
Yes, there are 6 or so of these on Sotheby's going for $2 to $5 million US.
Right.
And there's a bargain one going on eBay for 275,000.
Right.
Sell the house.
Well, I'm looking forward to Christmas, Aaron. That's very
Does anyone in the room think that they're going to be discovered in the next century? We laid down a body of work, but it hasn't been recognised yet.
Are there any artists in the room?
I'm sure we have some. Do we have some painters in the room?
I've only got 50,000 photographs,
50,000 photographs. Yeah.
all on 35mm slides.
I've taken
an
that
artist.
John, why do you think Impressionist paintings appeal to us? That's a tricky question, but
I think quite a bit of it is to do with the fact that we feel we know quite a lot about them. I mean, obviously the bodies of work are wonderful, and the bodies of work are amazingly prolific, and they were such committed artists. I think the sense of personality, the sense of place. I think we as a nation, I mean, I know it's an international thing, the admiration for the Impressionists, but I think we as a nation have a particular relationship with France, and I think that says something about us, and it says something about their appeal. Maybe in the sense that it was the last, I don't wish to be too disparaging about 20th century art, but it was the last gasp of something approaching realism, and we feel a sentimental affection. But I also think it is that business of, it's not just a place, it's at a place at a time to which the artist is reacting, and in the way they, in a non-conformist fashion, used style and depiction and so on, that gives us what we feel, whether it's right or not, I don't know, what we feel is a deeper insight into the emotional context of the work. And I think that means quite a lot to us.
It's also the everydayness of the paintings.
Yes.
Brought in by the technology, the barges, the railways, the bridges. Yeah, everything is there. I mean, nowadays people, they're horrified at anything of technology now. It's all horrible, you must get rid of it.
Yeah.
I mean, the amount of Victorian industrial and otherwise architecture that's just been destroyed, because it's just not light anymore.
Yeah, they didn't mind. They didn't mind a chimney stack or a distant factory or a warehouse. Well, a lot of...
in Battersea Power Station, for example. Beautiful building.
Yeah. Before it was turned into a playground for the mega rich.
Can I just say that I think with Impressionists, for me anyway, it captures the emotion that I might feel within that moment. The particular light that you get when it's about to snow or it has snowed.
Yes.
Or when you were pointing out the sunshine, when the sun was going down, and you just see that reflected on the tree and the last glimmer of it coming up, you feel that emotion that you feel in reality when you see something like that. And it brings that back. It stirs you, I think, emotionally.
Can I add to that, John? I think for me, bear in mind I'm from a science background, the fact that somebody is able to create with a stroke of the brush something that represents a human, or a tree, or an object, and yet the detail that we're so used to seeing in everyday life, the finest detail, is not there, and it therefore leaves room in our own imagination to create the person as we see them, and we would see them differently to somebody else. I think that is a magician at work.
So that we, in a sense, what we like is the way we're made to do a bit of work. And it forces us to engage with what's on the canvas more than other perfect sort of hyper-realist things might do. Yes, I appreciate that.
Yes, and following on from that, thinking about the water, the way the water is depicted, just with the lightest of brush strokes, but you can feel the movement. It is wonderful.
And John, has your love of painting trained you to look at the world differently or more appreciatively?
God, when I was doing this, I was staring at paintings so much and looking at them in such detail. I'd go out for a walk and I'd see every surface as if, and I was thinking, what are the brushstrokes of that? And sometimes I go, and it would look like, for a moment, it would look like a painting, because my mind had got so preoccupied with the business of technique of producing leaves or colours and so on. It was slightly disconcerting, but
But I think that can help us to appreciate what's around us.
yes, oh yes, you certainly, if you look at painting a bit, you look at what's around you more carefully. Yes.
Even looking at this is wonderful. But thank you once again to